The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. This is Terry Mathis from ProAct Safety. It looks like everyone's signed in now, so why don't we get started? By the way, I just wanted to mention that I've got a little offer for you. I'm going to be showing you quite a few questions to ask on the presentation, and if you will email to info@proactsafety.com, we'd be glad to email you a list of these questions. So if you're sitting there looking at the screen and saying, I can't frantically write down that many questions before he changes the slide, I've tried to pack a lot of information into the presentation here for you this morning so that you get a lot of value from this, and that will help out, I think, to keep you from getting writer's cramp as we go through the information. This presentation assumes that you are either currently doing a behavior-based safety process or that you're going to go to a site that is to audit them and help them look for opportunities to find new results. Very often we get called in as consultants behind implementations of behavior-based safety where the process has sometimes produced good results but is currently stalled or has quit producing results and has gone into kind of a hibernation mode. So these are some opportunities to take a look at the various factors of a BBS process and to look for further opportunities for improvement and enhancement of the process. Now, what is a BBS process? There's a lot of them out there. There are several consulting companies, quite a few college professors, and there's some off-the-shelf programs like Stop, Start, Take Two, Quick Start, a number of these programs. There's some elements that I'd like you to take a look at your process and see if they have. First of all of these processes should be or are centered around workers doing work. Now, these workers can be helped to be safer by a steering committee. Not all of these processes have a steering committee, but I highly recommend that you consider one. If you've done Stop or Start or one of these box programs, sometimes you had a sponsor. The purpose of a steering committee is to make BBS cultural. Get people from inside the culture to step up to the plate, to have a sense of pride and ownership in the process, and let them share that with their fellow employees. So if you don't have one, I really seriously recommend that you consider getting one. Now, what does this steering committee do? They should look at the information that comes from the accidents and near misses that are actually happening at the work site, and they should analyze these. And from these, they should develop the site checklist. Now, if you bought an off-the-shelf program, they handed you a checklist. I'm going to highly recommend that you customize that for your site. And if you haven't done that, or if you haven't changed your checklist or looked at your checklist to see if it needs changing, that's going to be one of your opportunities for doing this. Now, also BBS takes that checklist, wherever it came from, and they give it to a group of people called observers. Sometimes there's some other terminology, so don't get hung up on that. These observers take the checklist out to the workplace, and they basically do two things. They gather data and they give feedback. Now, there are a number of different strategies we're going to look at for how that can happen, how often that can happen, and what the strategy is for making it happen. The data that's gathered from the observers is usually crunched in some kind of computer program or spreadsheet, and it goes back to the steering committee. Now, if you don't have a steering committee and you're not using this data on the back end like some of the box programs or off-the-shelf programs do, this is another great opportunity for you. Now, what does the steering committee do? They use this data to develop action plans to facilitate the checklist behaviors happening out in the workplace. So step one of evaluating your existing program, do you have each of these pieces in place? If not, consider how you might go about putting them in place, and I think that will become clearer as we discuss each of the elements of it. First of all, everyone who is taking a part in the BBS process, if you don't have them, consider very strongly defining what we call RREs. These are roles, responsibilities, and expectations. And this can be different for the steering committee, different for the facilitator. If you have someone there at your site that's the facilitator of this process, it can be different for observers. And you might even consider what are the roles, responsibilities, and expectations of workers at the site as they participate in this process. I'll show you some examples. First of all, your workers. Do they understand your BBS process? Do they know what it's all about? If you hired me as a consultant and I walked out in your workplace and I said, tell me about your BBS process, if it has a name and a logo or whatever, I'd ask specifically about that. Can they tell me about it? Do they know how it works? Do they know what it's all about? Can they name the checklist behaviors? This is a really interesting concept, and it's one that's relatively new to BBS. But if you have a really long checklist, I can almost guarantee you that your workers can't name those. What if you narrowed them down and worked on them a few at a time? Could you get it to where your workers could tell you which behaviors you're targeting right now? I promise you, if they can't get them in their heads, they can't get them in their habits, not permanently. Can they name their steering team representative? Now, your steering team should be representative of the various areas of the plant. So any worker might not know everybody who's on that team, but they ought to know the person from their area. Can they name a success that came from the BBS process? Can they tell you something at their site that the BBS process did that helped them? Do they feel BBS makes them safer? And do they have opportunities to get involved? Now, I'm asking a lot of questions about workers. How do you answer these questions? Go ask them. Walk out on the floor and ask some workers these particular questions, or bring them in focus groups and ask them these questions, and determine, do you have the level of worker understanding of your process that's necessary to make it successful? Now, what about your steering team? Well, if you did something like a DuPont Stop program, you may not have a steering team, and getting one can be very valuable. A steering team can be brought together, one person from each major area or job at the site, and they can be trained rather quickly, especially if you have an existing process, and they can be asked to be the ones to steer the process, to make basic decisions about how the process works. Now, if you have a steering team, or a steering committee, by the way, they're very often called, again, don't get caught in terminology if you've done this a little bit different way. Is your steering team too large or too small? Now, we often discuss something that we call critical mass. Do you have enough people on your steering team to represent the culture? Do you have too many people on your steering team to meet regularly, to be able to come to consensus, to be able to work well together? Ideal steering teams, to me, usually range between about 4 and 12. You get much less than 4, and if you lose 1 or 2, you lose your critical mass. You're dead in the water. If you get a team much bigger than 12, it's very often difficult for them to get together, to meet, to come to consensus, to be able to discuss things, and very often large teams divide into factions. You get a team of 15, and it's very often 8 against 7 or 9 against 6. And the minority feels like they don't belong on the team, feels like they can't get anything done or anything through. So think about the size of your team. Do they have the needed skills and training? Can they hold a successful meeting? Can they come to consensus? Can they brainstorm? Can they analyze their data? Now, if they can't, one answer could be training, but another answer could be a facilitator. I go to a lot of teams that have some fairly sophisticated data. They've never had any formal training in statistics or data analysis. So rather than trying to turn them into statisticians, we get an engineer from the site and let him be an ad hoc, non-voting member of the team to just come in and help them understand what the data is really telling them. Now, what is their average meeting attendance percentage? Can they get all their people to the meeting? Now, if you go back up to question number 1, sometimes these two conflict with each other. What if you wanted to make your steering team representative of the whole site, so you got somebody from every area off every shift? One of the things that you find sometimes is that you can never get them together. You can't get the people are not willing to come in off shift or on days off, and they're not willing to stay over for meetings, and so you actually build a steering team that can't be a team, that can't meet. Try your best not to do that. A team that can't meet is not going to function as a team. So what percentage of your steering team gets to their meetings? If it's low, you need to work on that. You need to take a look at that, and we'll talk about how. Do they regularly review their checklist? Now, what do you review the checklist against? 2 sets of data. One is ongoing accident data. Each time an accident happens at the site, or periodically, the team ought to look at that accident and ask themselves this question: do I have the behavior on my checklist that could have prevented that accident? Now, one accident that's not on your checklist isn't necessarily a reason to change your checklist, but a series of accidents, a trend in accidents, definitely can be. The other thing they ought to be looking at is what other items that are not on the checklist are observers regularly writing notes about. So if you have an additional comments section on your checklist and your observers are bringing this back in, you ought to be looking at it. What if your observers are regularly not checking an item on the front of your checklist? They're not seeing it as an item, but they're regularly writing something else on. That might be a suggestion that your checklist needs to change. Now, the goal of BBS review like this isn't to change your checklist. It's to see if it needs to be changed. If your checklist is too large, I would recommend you downsize it. We're going to talk about that as we get to the checklist. But is the steering team doing their job of making sure the checklist is pertinent, it's up to date, and it's addressing the most critical behaviors? Are the steering team members well respected by their peers? Are they looked up to as safety examples and spokespeople for the various areas that they come from? Now, warning here, it's always inviting to get new people on your steering team, and very likely if you have some turnover, you should have one or two. But if you have everybody on your steering team that's new, they're not going to know what they're doing well enough to really steer the process. So beware the all-new steering team. They won't be respected by their peers because they haven't been there long enough to really understand what the issues are. Are your steering team members good at utilizing their data to improve safety? Do they really understand what the data is telling them? Are they able to develop action plans from that data? And do those action plans really make a difference? And the last one, this is kind of interesting, is your steering team motivated? Do they have a high level of energy when they come together, or are their knuckles dragging the ground as they walk into their meetings each day? This is very, very important, and motivating the steering team might be your job as the facilitator or the safety professional, or it might be the plant manager's job. But you ought to think of, you ought to think, are they motivated? And if they're not, you really ought to develop a motivational strategy. A lot of good new information, by the way, on motivation. If you haven't read Daniel Pink's new book called Drive, it will really change your thinking about the old carrot and stick kind of motivational strategies. Now, one of the other things that happens to steering teams very often, when we get called back in, especially in stale processes or stalling processes, we find that the steering team is what we call is process-oriented instead of results-oriented. Now, again, there's some questions here on this slide to get you thinking about this. What's the goal of BBS? If it is to hit a target number of observations, if it's to get everybody to your meetings, then your steering team is becoming process-oriented. The goal of BBS is to reduce accidents and to address accidents and to get to zero, to stay at zero. You know, if they've lost sight of that, you need to get them back thinking that way. Now, yes, it's critical that you hit your target number of observations. It's critical that you get your people to your meetings, but that is not the goal of BBS. Those are all tools to get things going. If you're driving a car and you're concerned with your RPMs instead of your MPHs, you know, and your speed, you're thinking about the wrong thing. Now, that speed of your motor is critical to making your car go down the road, but that's not the goal. So, who determines the value of BBS? What's the focus? What triggers an observation? And by the way, if observations are only triggered by a quota system, you're getting process-oriented again. Observations ought to be triggered by the need for observations, the value of observations to go into an area, find out what's wrong, and solve problems. What's the knowledge of the precautions? In other words, the items on your checklist, can people tell you what they are? And what are the successes? What's your team really doing? You see, if they're thinking, well, we hit our target number of observations, we've done our job. That's the process orientation. If they're saying we're doing all the things in our process and our process is producing results, that's the way you want them to think. Now, what about the checklist? How old is it? How was it developed originally? I've seen some checklists that were developed by consensus. We took a vote and said, what do you think is the most important thing to put on the checklist? Really bad way to do it. By the way, we're going to have a seminar coming up soon on how to develop a checklist, how to do a Pareto analysis. So if that wasn't a part of your original process, it might be something that you want to consider. Does your checklist address your current safety issues? Now, even if you did a Pareto analysis, let's say of 3 or 4 years worth of accident data, and put the most pertinent, most critical or crucial, whatever your terminology, behaviors on that checklist, is it still current? Have those issues changed over the last 3 or 4 years? And you can almost guarantee they will if you've had a major change in your workplace or your workforce. So if you've had a lot of turnover, if you've put in a lot of new equipment, put in a new line of production or something like that, very likely the safety issues could have changed. Are you current with that? Are you looking at that? Is your checklist too long or too short? Most checklists tend to be too long. The old thinking was if you identify 25 behaviors that could impact your accidents, put them all on a checklist. The newer thinking is, no, pick the significant few. In almost all Pareto analyses, there's a significant few and a trivial many. Even if you have 25 behaviors to work on, if you'll work on them 4 or 5 at a time, get them into the habits of your workforce and then move on to others, that has proven over the last 10 years to be a superior way of doing BBS. Is your checklist designed for convenient use and data entry? In other words, are the items on your checklist in the same order as your computer program? There are a lot of things sometimes that just the design, the style of the checklist can be enhanced. You know, and if you've got a stale process, a new-looking checklist kind of gives it a new feel also, especially if it's not just stylistic, but it's actually functional, you know, and easier to use. Do you have the right variables to analyze your data? If you're putting your data into a database program of some kind, you can divide this by things like days of the week, hours of the day, and other things. A lot of people are getting even further into their data. For instance, they're analyzing what's the tenure of the employee observed, and they're finding out that new employees or old employees or a certain tenure of employees tend to take certain kinds of risks. All of this can be potentially helpful in analyzing your data, especially the more mature your process is. So do you have the right variables in your data? And is it really the focus for worker safety? Now, what am I talking about? If you walked out there on the floor and you ask your workers, what is the most likely thing to get you hurt? What is the precaution that if you take it will make the biggest difference in safety? Are they going to name the things that are on your checklist, or is their attention somewhere else? Really important issue on your checklist. Now, we recommend that your checklist be what we call transformational. And what does that mean? It means what will make the biggest difference. Focus your people on the things that will make the biggest difference. Now, what if you did a Pareto analysis and you identified 25 behaviors that could make a difference in safety? I promise you there's probably 4 or 5 that are high impact and the rest of them are lower impact. So can you focus on those? But in addition to just which behaviors you're going to focus on, there's other things you can focus on also, such as day of the week, time of the day, which shift takes more risk than others, which location, job types, tenures of employees, tenure even on task. Sometimes it's not how long they've been at the plant, but how long they've been doing this current job. When you start looking at these, and by the way, you can't look at them if they're not variables in your checklist. It's awfully hard to divide that data by something that you didn't capture. So all of these are opportunities. Now, remember we asked the question a little bit earlier also, what prompts an observation? What if you find that, like in this chart up on the top, that 45% of your risk that you see taken are taken on Wednesdays? Well, how about focusing more observations on Wednesday than you do other days and try to find out what's going on there and what you can do about it? These are the kind of things that can really spark interest in a process. If people are just going through the motions trying to hit their target numbers of observations and they start looking at their data and seeing this kind of information, it starts to spark the creative juices to say, hey, here's something that we can do that really could make a difference. Now, based on that, what is your observation strategies? Do you have a sampling strategy? And by the way, if you don't have a sampling strategy, don't trust trending of your data. If you're gathering the sample a different way every month, you really can't see trends in it, or you really can't trust them. Do your observers regularly hit their target numbers? You know, if you don't have the critical mass of observations, this isn't going to get done. Think about how BBS can really make a difference. You've got a group of people that are trying to make a difference in safety. How can they do it? Well, every time they make contact with one of their fellow workers, they challenge their habits, they challenge their perceptions of danger. They can focus them on your checklist items, which if they're the right ones can make a difference. They can also identify things that get in the way of safety, barriers, things that make it difficult or impossible to do these behaviors on the checklist. All of that happens during an observation. If you don't have enough observations, you're not challenging those habits. You're not changing people's behaviors, and you're not finding out what's getting in the way. So a sub-optimization of your process is very often not doing enough. Do the observers see the results of their efforts? Sean Galloway and I often talk about what we call a black hole system. What if their data goes into a black hole and nothing ever comes back out? They never see reports. They never see action plans. They never see percentages. They're going to quit gathering this data over a period of time or become demotivated to do so if they don't see it happening. Is your percent safe going up? And is there a correlation between percent safe and your TRIR? You know, theoretically, if you're working on the right behaviors, if you get people to do them more regularly, the accidents related to those are going to go down. Do you see that correlation? Can you get your team looking for that? Has the observation strategy ever changed? Have you been doing it the same way ever since you started? Sean did a webinar like this last month on observation strategies and various ways of arranging and distributing observations. I'm going to touch on that, but there's a whole webinar about that. If that's one of your opportunities, that might be some information you want to catch also. Do observers rotate assignments? Are they doing the same thing over and over? One of the enemies of motivation is the sameness, the staleness, the repetition, the meaninglessness of an assignment. Now, when it's new, it'll hold your interest for a while, but if it becomes old, if it becomes routine and stale, then observers burn out. So can you rotate their assignments? Now, that can be rotating where they go, or it can be rotating what they do. I was just at a site that their observers actually do observations for 3 months, and then they're off for 3 months. So they have twice as many observers as they need, but they're only active every other 3 months, and they love it. Now, that's not the perfect formula for every site, but that's working very well for that one. And they didn't think about it until they started looking at some of these options. Do your observers confront their fellow workers, or do they try to find out the rationale? And this is a critical, critical area. A lot of processes taught people to go out and say, hey, dummy, don't do it that way. Really, really bad idea. There's an assumption that's becoming more and more prevalent among the behavioral sciences that people do things for a reason. If you don't change the reason, you very likely will not change why they do things. There's also a new thinking that the best way to confront is simply to question, to go to someone and say, I'm concerned about that. Why do you do it that way? So if your observers are trying to fix everything on the spot, they're trying to talk people into things, you know, there's a lot of new information that indicates that's not the best way. So these are all opportunities to breathe new life into an existing process. Ask yourself these questions. Help yourself identify what your opportunities are. We call this gathering insight rather than just gathering data. If you go out there and you find out someone's using the wrong tool for the job, that's data. If you find out why they're using the wrong tool for the job and you start to see trends in that, That's insight. That's helping you understand what's happening. Now, your observers, like Doug Larson's little quote down here, very often want to do all the talking. If they'll do some listening, they can really pay off big benefits. Little model that we use very often in helping people understand, when you ask why, I'm concerned about that, why do you do it? If people say, well, I've done it before and I've never gotten hurt, that's a perception. If they say, I don't know, it's just the way I always do it, that's a habit. If they say it's difficult to do it any other way because, that's an obstacle. If they say it's impossible to do it any other way because, that's a barrier. Now, what's the wisdom of knowing why? The wisdom of knowing why is because then you know how to fix it. If you assume, like we do, that people do things for a reason, you need to change the reason. So what do you change? You change perceptions, you change habits, you remove or reduce obstacles or barriers, or find a workaround for them. Now, if someone's using the wrong tool for the job because they don't know what the right tool is or they don't perceive accurately what it is, you can do that with information. If they don't have the right tool, no amount of information or talking is going to change that. And if you don't know why this behavior is or is not happening, you're not in a very good position to do anything about it. So based around that little model of what influences people to take risk, we have what we call the film model, and there's a whole webinar on this one also. FILM stands for focus, influence, listen, and measure. You focus people on your checklist behavior, you influence them to do these things, you listen to why they don't, and you measure to see if you're making progress. Now, what about your observation data? Does it go into a black hole, or do the observers see it come back out? Is the access to the data controlled? Do you have the right people looking at it? Is it actionable? Now, this is a lot of what we've been talking about here. If you don't ask why, you know that people are using the wrong tool for the job. Is that actionable data? I went to a site just recently. They had over 3,000 observations logged, and you look at all of them, it says using the wrong tool for the job, using poor body mechanics. You know, these were all their comments. Now, what do you do about that? You know what, but you don't know why. And if you don't know why, you don't know how to fix it. You're shooting in the dark. You can develop action plans, but your action plans are not very well focused. Does your steering team develop these action plans from the data? And is some of this data shared back with the workers and the observers? Have these action plans resulted in successful safety improvements? Now, all of these questions are designed to say, does your steering team understand their data? Is their data adequate and actionable, and is it being used correctly? If it's not, here's some fabulous opportunities to improve your process. Now, one of the reasons processes fail is because the support for them starts to lag. So do you have support from your managers, from your supervisors, even from your workers? You know, do your people involved in the process have the time and the resources to be successful? Is this viewed, also participation in this, is it viewed as something that's desirable and worthwhile? Or is it an assignment that people dread? Is communication about BBS positive? When leaders say something about the BBS process, do they roll their eyes? Do they look disgusted? Do they look resigned? You know, or do they talk about it like it's something positive, it's something valuable in your organization? There's an old saying that if you want to build a ship, don't drum up men and gather wood. Divide the work and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Now, what we're talking about is getting people's hearts as well as their minds involved in safety. And you know what? When you start with heart, you end with fabulous results. We have a conference every year here in Houston. One of the things I say to the people who attend that conference is this. I tell them, you know, there's two kinds of people in the world, the people who care and the people who don't care. And the people who don't care don't get involved in safety because they don't care. And the people who do care make a fabulous difference in the world. And it's an honor and a privilege to work with the people who care. If you go to your people who are involved in BBS and you don't just appeal to their minds and say, look, this is a really neat theory and it makes a lot of sense. If you go to them and you say, look, this is something that can help you and your fellow workers avoid pain and injury and suffering and financial hardships and all the things that come with accidents, and you appeal to the altruistic as well as the intellectual, that's where we get a lot of bang for the buck. If you haven't seen a site called despair.com, a website, if you like sarcasm, you can get a chuckle out of this website. They have a sarcastic version of, I think, every motivational poster ever made. This is one of Sean Galloway's favorite, and he actually has this one up in his office. It says, if a pretty poster and a cute saying are all it takes to motivate you, you probably have a very easy job, the kind robots will be doing soon. You know, don't make this demotivating, and don't make it robotic. What your workers are doing in BBS, go back to them and tell them, look, this is too important to fail. We need to make this process successful because it's the well-being of ourselves and our fellow workers are at stake. Last thought here for you. There's something called SWOT Analysis, S-W-O-T, and it's a pretty neat way of thinking about things. When you go in and look at and ask these questions that I've encouraged you to ask about your process, one of the things that can happen is you will identify that your process probably has some things that they're doing well. You know, and look for those. Look carefully. Don't make this a fault-finding mission. And when you build on strengths, it's almost always more successful than when you try to hack away at weaknesses. Now, you'll find weaknesses also, and they're things that you need to turn into strengths. But you'll also find opportunities, and you may find threats. This is a really good way to divide the data you find. When you walk into a site and analyze a process, this is the way Sean and I and our consultants think about it. We say, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of this particular process, and what can we do to move things from one category to another, or to address things when we do them. And there's some suggestions here for how that can happen. So here's my suggestion to you. If you've got an existing BBS process, take a look at it. Sit down with your steering team or whoever the leaders are. Walk out on the floor with some of the observers as they do their observations. Walk out on the floor when there's not observers present and talk to workers and ask them how they perceive this process. Consider the questions that I've proposed to you here this morning. Ask those questions. Divide your finding into strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and look for opportunities to breathe new life into your existing process. Build on the strengths. Don't focus too strongly on the weaknesses. Address them, but don't focus on them. Don't demotivate the people that are involved in this. Make sure you've got the right people involved, and if not, try to rotate and get some better people involved in your process and breathe new life into it with these strategies. I think if you do, you'll find that even the most stale process can be renewed and can be made better. If you'd like additional information on this topic or on any of the others, please look at all of our free podcasts that you can find on our website. All the articles that we've written also are available through our website or through the publications that have published them. Help yourselves to that free information, and if we can be of further assistance here at ProAct Safety, please either give us a call or an email, and let's see what we can do to help you to analyze your existing process and get it back to the results that you wanted it to produce in the first place. Thank you for attending this webinar this morning. If you have any questions, please email them in. We're just about at our time, a little bit past our time here this morning, but we do have one question here that's been sent in that I'd like to answer. One of the folks says, I've got a STOP program and I'd like to establish a steering team. How would you suggest I do that? I would suggest that, first of all, you announce to your workforce that you want to form a steering team around the STOP process and that you'd like volunteers. Now, when you do that, make sure that you set a realistic level of expectation that you can't take all the volunteers, that you're only going to be able to take one from each department, but that there will be future opportunities to be on the steering team. So if you're not selected in the first round, you might have opportunities at a later date. Once you get these in, select your best from each area. If you don't have any from some areas, go out and select someone and ask them if they'd be willing to volunteer. Don't push too hard, don't force people, and make sure you get the right kind of people that are respected by their fellow workers on the team. Get this team together, offer them a little bit of training in what this is all about. If you have your STOP materials, go back over them with them and challenge them to take a look at the STOP process and look for the data coming in from it and see if they can't find opportunities to develop action plans to make the STOP process go better. That's the only question that's on the board as of right now. If you have any others, please send them in. If I don't have time to get to them, as I won't here as we're ending up today, I'll send you an email back if you'll send it in with it, and be glad to answer any of your questions via email. Thank you so much for attending this morning. I hope that you've gotten some good ideas of how to go back and look at your process and look for those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and use that information to make a stronger and more successful process. Thank you.